Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. So hello everyone, my name is Stephanie and I will be presenting an abbreviated chapter of my master's thesis. My presentation today is called Writing About Reading, How Memoirs of Childhood Reading Identify the Child Within. So my presentation today asks two questions. Number one, what is the role of writing to reading and remembering to memoirs? And what do memoirs of childhood reading reveal about ourselves as readers and writers in childhood versus adulthood? Now, if we had more time, I would allow us to share our responses, but for now, just keep it in the back of your mind. And I want to ask you all, what memories of reading can you recall from childhood? Now, if you were to write for 5 minutes, what memories of reading can you recall? And how do your reading interests as a child compare to those now as an adult? So what is the memoir of childhood reading that I refer to? I call them bibliomemoirs or memoirs of childhood reading, and they fall under the category of life writing. They're typically written in first person, where the narrator is the author. And the only definition that I found, since there is limited scholarship on this relatively new subgenre, is by Joyce Carol Oates. And she states, bibliomemoir is a subspecies of literature, combining criticism and biography with the intimate confessional tone of autobiography. This subgenre grew in the 1990s and differs from other memoirs in that they center around reading. For my master's thesis, I selected recent memoirs only about childhood reading from the West. This selection allowed me to research similarities in British and Canadian childhood, schooling, and cultural memory. What I discovered from my memoirs was the importance of rereading, meaning reading a book from childhood again in adulthood to remembering and writing. My definition would be that bibliomemoirs are a subgenre of memoirs of childhood, focused specifically on one or more stories read during childhood and reread in adulthood. These memoirs identify a thread between childhood and adulthood. They also refer to the physical properties of books and literary criticism to affirm their memories and feelings about a childhood past. My selection of memoirs are Frances Spufford's The Child That Books Built, A Life in Reading from 2002, Margaret McKee's One Child's Reading, My Autobibliography from 2016, and Jane Sullivan's Storytime, Growing Up with Books from 2019. I applied 3 methodologies to my work. So the first was close reading, and I considered the kinds of language used to denote memory, such as looking back, and the significance of formal features like chapter titles for organizing remembrances. Next, I used reader response theory as I compared Spufford, McKee, and Sullivan's responses to their rereadings, and I consider what meaning they bring to their childhood stories. And lastly, I engaged with autobiographical theory. I especially used Sidonie Smith and Julia Watson's guide, and I analyzed the different kinds of I in these memoirs and how these authors self-identify. As post-war childhood narratives, these memoirs reveal similarities among popular authors for children that reflect new notions of childhood and make a case for reading memoirs as historical documents. An example of the cultural and historical value of these memoirs, all 3 memoirs do not remember creative writing in school, which I'll discuss, perhaps because it was not in England and Canada's 1960s curriculum. So what I analyze in these memoirs is the relationship that Hugh Crago explores, which is that story making and story reading are apparently very different activities, yet they can evoke similar experiences. He further writes, writing works like reading a story if we consider the significance of the performer in both activities and their emotional responses. This falls in line with reader response theory. He states, quote, the parallels between the experience of the entranced reader and inspired writer are, to my mind, inescapable, end quote. Memoir writing, including the memoirs I analyzed, has a unique relationship to remembering, in that writing can spark memories that would otherwise lie dormant, and in remembering memories of the self, a history of the self is actively constructed. According to new Reconstructionist views of memory, as explored by Charles Fernyhough, when our memories are retrieved, they are recalled with the addition of our current experiences. They are not like DVDs, which are preserved in their original format and can be replayed at any time. Our memories are also influenced by what Kate Douglas calls cultural memory, which includes collective sentiments of an era. As Kate Douglas describes in her chapter, creating childhood autobiography and cultural memory. Memory drives autobiography, and in turn, autobiographies influence perceptions of the ways in which memory functions. And on the bottom here, I have an example of how memory is stored and retrieved. So now applying what we know about the way memory works and the ways writing can influence recall, what is the relationship between writing and reading as evident in my sample memoirs? To give you some background on my sample memoirists' lives, all three memoirists reread stories from childhood and either kept notes about their reactions or what they remembered. While Spufford minimally digresses about his writing habits or the creation of his memoir, McKee provides an in-depth discussion of what allows her to write about childhood, which was revisiting and rereading her material. Sullivan too explores the relationship between writing a memoir and remembering childhood, and she states, quote, "It's only now as I'm writing this that I realize my father was using the ritual phrases to hypnotize me to sleep." About her father's bedtime story, Septimus the Frog, that always ended, "Down, down, dives Septimus to the bottom of the pond." Memoir writing allows Sullivan to organize her thoughts and recall memories. McKee, however, believes, quote, "The villain is the narrative impulse that ruthlessly eliminates the randomness in favor of a streamlined and tellable set of causal relationships," end quote. McKee opposes the way memoir writing shies away from what often cannot be remembered in a clear way, and therefore she relies heavily on the physical books rather than on her memory. There's a wonderful illustration here of what I interpret as the same individual rereading stories in childhood and later in adulthood. While writing and reading are interconnected and are often developed simultaneously in elementary school, children's writing is often understudied and undervalued in education. However, I use Deborah Brandt's Remembering Writing, Remembering Reading, and she reveals the extent to which people remember writing versus reading in childhood, and the significance of those recollections. Her results found that people typically remembered their first reading experiences as pleasurable occasions, endorsed if not organized by adults. Many early writing experiences, particularly those set outside of school, were remembered as occurring out of the eye of adult supervision. While many adults remember reading, many did not remember writing anything but expository book reports at school. If they did write as children, it was often in secret forms, like diaries, and many remembered their parents only writing to pay the bills. What I learned is that not only are Spufford, McKee, and Sullivan's memories valuable, in that we lack an abundance of literature on writing and reading experiences from childhood, but their practices in childhood may have also been unique. Applying Brandt's results to bibliomemoirs provides historical and cultural background for studying memoirs of literacy. It also acutely relates writing and reading to memory. And so I argue that all three authors were memoirists since childhood, documenting their life and their reading. Spufford, McKee, and Sullivan do include their earliest memories of writing, unlike Brandt's participants. Spufford recalls straining to read The Hobbit as a child, and how by the time he reached The Hobbit's last page, though, the writing had softened and lost the outlines of the printed alphabet. Sullivan writes, "Reading in turn led to a desire to write, and she became a journalist and much later a fiction writer." Her earliest memories of writing relate to her father's daily comic strips, and she writes, "As soon as I could form words, I was giving my characters balloons and putting words in them." And McKee too kept lockable diaries, self-written cowboy game instructions, and scrapbooks of her, quote, pedestrian life. Her diaries especially helps with pinning down some details of time passing, and she says that's one of the major accomplishments of literacy. And so in conclusion, all three memoirs note that they wrote a lot in childhood in addition to being, quote, bookworms, and have been memoirs their whole lives. Their self-writing has changed in that their adult perceptions of themselves as children are altered by the present. What Brandt's study and my own aims to do is make meaning of reading and writing. Rereading and writing these memoirs reveals the extent to which our growth is rooted in stories stacked on shelves. Memoir writing and reading become a way to journey in old age and perhaps resist the progression of time. Ending their narratives in childhood, Spufford, McKee, and Sullivan conclude as open books, with the rest of their lives and stories yet to be imagined. And this is my literature cited and the images. Thank you.